Her younger sister was destined to marry the son of a billionaire. A mansion in Beacon Hill, designer clothes from head to toe, a $1 million car parked in the driveway. And her? She was sold by her own father to the man no one in Boston dared to name, the Grey Wolf, the most feared mafia boss on the East Coast. Her sister laughed in her face. "You're worthless. You can't even have children. You deserve to be thrown away." But barely a year later, that same sister was on her knees, tears streaming down her face, begging for money. And the monster the whole city feared? He stood right beside her, his hand resting gently on her back, his eyes looking at her so tenderly that her sister froze, because that was a look her sister, despite marrying a billionaire, had never received from anyone. So what happened in that 1 year? Why did the most powerful man in Boston fall so deeply for this worthless woman? And what secret had connected them from 8 years ago? If you want to know how the Grey Wolf fell in love with her, hit that like button right now. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what happens next. The story begins here. Paige Holloway was 28 years old, an accountant at a small shipping company in Boston. Every day was a gray blur of routine. She woke at 6, drank her black coffee in silence, and endured 8 hours of glowing computer screens before returning to her cramped one-bedroom apartment in South Boston, where a small balcony overlooked a dark alley. She had lived alone since she was 22, after her mother died and her father began to change. Paige's life was so quiet, so still, it was almost invisible. No one at the office remembered her birthday. No one called to check on her over the weekend. She existed like a shadow, drifting through the city without leaving any trace behind. That evening, Paige was sitting by the window reading when her phone rang. Her father's name flashed across the screen. She frowned. Gerald Holloway hardly ever called her unless something serious had happened. She picked up. "Paige." His voice trembled, rough and raw like a man who had drunk far too much. "Come home right now. Right now." "Dad, what's going on?" "Just come home. I'll explain." Then he hung up. Paige stared at the phone in her hand, a deep unease rising inside her. She grabbed her coat, called a taxi, and crossed the city in the middle of the night. The old Holloway family house stood on the outskirts of Boston. It had once been a warm place when her mother was still alive, but now it looked ruined and hollow. The paint on the walls was peeling. The yard was wild with overgrown grass. Not a single light was on except in the living room. Paige stepped inside and found her father sitting in the dark. Gerald Holloway was 58 years old, but he looked 70. His hair had gone completely white, his back had bent with age and defeat, and his eyes were bloodshot from too many sleepless nights. In his hand was an empty glass of liquor, his fingers trembling around it. "Dad." Paige sat down across from him. "What's happened?" Gerald didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the empty glass and sat there in silence for a long time. The air in the room felt heavy, as if a storm were about to break. Then he spoke, his voice like a man drowning. "I owe money, Paige. A lot of money." Paige waited. $2,800,000. She thought she must have heard him wrong. "What did you say?" "Gambling." Gerald gave a bitter laugh. "After your mother died, I couldn't bear it. I turned to the casinos to forget. I thought I could stop whenever I wanted. But I was wrong. The more I lost, the more I played. And the more I played, the deeper I fell into debt. Until there was nothing left for me to pawn." Paige sat there feeling as if someone had just poured ice water down her spine. "The original debt came from an underground casino," Gerald continued, his voice shaking. "When I couldn't pay, they sold it to someone else. And that someone..." He stopped and swallowed hard. That someone was the Kincaid organization. Paige knew the name. Everyone in Boston knew it. The Kincaid organization controlled the harbor, the real estate, and many other things people only dared to whisper about. No one knew exactly what they did, but everyone knew one thing. You didn't make enemies of them. They gave me one choice. Gerald looked up, his eyes red and fevered. "Not money. They don't need money. Then what do they want?" Gerald stayed silent for a long moment. Then he spoke, and his voice came out like a breath dragged from the bottom of his lungs. "They want one of my 2 daughters." Paige shot to her feet, her heart pounding out of control. "What did you say?" "The man at the head of that organization, Reed Kincaid, wants to marry one of my daughters." Gerald lowered his head. "All of Boston calls him the Grey Wolf. No one knows his face. No one knows how old he is. All anyone knows is that he controls everything. and the people who cross him disappear without a trace. Paige felt her legs turn weak beneath her. She had to grip the back of the chair to keep from collapsing. "I was going to give them Brooke," Gerald went on. "Because she's younger. Because I thought." He didn't finish the sentence, but Paige understood. Her father thought Brooke was prettier, more valuable, more worthy of being married into somewhere grand. And Paige? Paige was the older daughter, the quiet one, the invisible one, the child no one remembered. She stood there as that old familiar pain rose inside her once more. But before she could say a word, the living room door flew open. Brooke stepped inside, her eyes red from crying, yet her mouth was curved into a strange smile. Brooke Holloway was 26 years old, beautiful in the kind of way that made people turn their heads without meaning to. Her hair was golden, her skin smooth and pale, and her blue eyes knew exactly how to shimmer at the perfect moment. She knew she was beautiful, and she used that beauty the way some people used a weapon. That night, she walked into the living room with a face caught somewhere between tears and fury. Yet there was something in her eyes that didn't match the tears on her cheeks. She stopped in the middle of the room, looked at her father, then turned to Paige. "I heard everything," Brooke said, her voice trembling, yet edged with something sharp and cold. "Every single word." Gerald rose to his feet and started toward his younger daughter. "Brooke, let me explain." "Explain what?" Brooke cut him off, her voice rising. "Explain that you want to sell me to a criminal? To a man whose name no one in Boston even dares to say out loud? What do you think I am? Some piece of property to pay off your debt? This is the only way," Gerald said, his voice worn down with exhaustion. "I don't have a choice." "You do have a choice," Brooke screamed. "You can sell the house, sell the car, sell anything you own, but not me." Paige stood still in the corner of the room, silent as she watched. She saw the way Brooke cried, the way she trembled, the way she wrapped her arms around herself like a frightened child. But something about it wasn't right. The tears fell at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right way, as though they had been rehearsed. Brooke went on, her voice thick with emotion. "I have Spencer, Dad. Do you even remember that? Spencer Whitmore, the only son of the Whitmore family. He loves me. He's going to propose to me in a few months. My future is a mansion on Beacon Hill, diamonds, designer clothes, not some life with a mafia man hiding in some dark corner of the world." Gerald shook his head. "Brooke, this is my decision. You're younger. You have to listen to me." "I will never accept this," Brooke shouted. "Do you hear me? Never. If you force me, I won't survive it. I'd rather die." Gerald froze. Paige froze too. But before either of them could say another word, Brooke turned and ran to her room, slamming the door behind her. The sound of the lock clicking into place echoed through the house. Then there was silence. Gerald sank back into his chair, both hands clutching his head. He looked as though he had aged 10 years in a matter of minutes. Paige stood there, not knowing what to do. She wanted to say something, but the words caught and died in her throat. 15 minutes passed. The air inside the house grew so heavy it became hard to breathe. Then a loud crash came from Brooke's room, the sound of bottles shattering, the thud of objects hitting the floor. Gerald jumped to his feet. Paige ran after him. They pounded on the door and called Brooke's name, but no answer came. Gerald stepped back and slammed his shoulder into the door. Once, twice. On the third hit, the door burst open. Brooke was lying on the floor, her eyes closed, surrounded by the mess of a fallen vase and shattered glass. Gerald cried out like a wounded animal. He threw himself toward her, his hands shaking as he checked for a pulse. Paige stood frozen in the doorway, her heart hammering wildly in her chest. Minutes later, the sirens of an ambulance cut through the night. Amidst her father's hysterical sobs and the sterile silence of the hospital corridors, Paige waited. She didn't pray. She observed. Then the doctor came back out, his expression strangely calm. "She's fine," the doctor said. It was a temporary collapse brought on by extreme emotional stress and exhaustion. Gerald let out a sob of relief and cried from the weight of it. But Paige stood motionless, her mind beginning to fit the pieces together. The calculated chaos of the room, the loud noise, the way Brooke had positioned herself on the floor so she would be seen the moment the door was broken down, the way she had cried earlier, the way she had said she'd rather die with just the right amount of drama in her voice. It was all an act. Brooke knew exactly what she was doing. She didn't want to die. She wanted her father to be so terrified that he'd never dare force her again. and she had succeeded. Paige looked through the glass of the hospital room and saw Brooke lying in bed, her eyes still closed. Gerald sat beside her, holding her hand, tears streaming down his face. He didn't suspect a thing. Then Brooke opened her eyes. The first thing she did wasn't cry. She didn't reach for her father. She looked straight through the glass, straight at Paige. And in that look, Paige saw something colder than the sterile hospital air around them. Her eyes were filled with cold calculation. Brooke recovered so quickly it was almost suspicious. Only a few hours after being taken to the hospital, she was already sitting up in bed, bright-eyed and fresh as though nothing had happened at all. The doctor said she could be discharged that same day, but Gerald insisted that she stay one more night for observation. He sat beside his daughter's bed, his eyes red and swollen from too much crying, his trembling hand wrapped tightly around Brooke's, as if he were afraid she might disappear. Paige stood in the corner of the room, silent as she watched. She saw the way Brooke glanced at their father with a hidden sense of satisfaction tucked neatly behind her mask of frailty. She saw the way her sister closed her eyes now and then, and let out a soft sigh, as if she were still exhausted. It was a flawless performance. Gerald spoke first, his voice rough and hoarse. "I won't force you any more, Brooke. I can't bear losing another person I love. Your mother is gone, and I can't let anything happen to either of you." Brooke opened her eyes and looked at him with a kind of gratitude so false it almost shimmered. "Thank you, Dad. I know you love me." Then she turned to Paige. Those blue eyes went cold for the briefest instant, before sweetness flowed back into them again. "Then Paige has to go in my place." Paige wasn't surprised. She had known this was coming from the moment she saw Brooke's eyes through the glass of the hospital room. She only stood there in silence. Gerald started to say something, but Brooke continued, her voice so sweet it was almost frightening. "Anyway, she's a much better fit for it, isn't she? She's older. She doesn't have anyone, and most importantly," she paused, and the smile on her lips curved into something cruel, "she can't have children. What man would want to marry her?" The air in the hospital room turned thick and motionless. Gerald shouted, "Brooke, stop right now!" But Brooke ignored him. She looked straight into Paige's eyes, as if she were savoring the pain on her sister's face. "Do you remember 6 years ago? The night I called you at 2 o'clock in the morning and asked you to come get me because I was too drunk to drive? You remember, don't you?" Paige remembered. She remembered every detail. The winter night that cut through the skin like glass. The call from Brooke, her voice slurred from alcohol. Paige had thrown on her coat and driven across the city through the rain to pick her up. On the way home, when they were only 10 minutes from the house, a truck ran a red light and slammed straight into the driver's side. Paige woke up in the hospital 3 days later. Broken ribs, internal injuries, and complications, the doctor explained to her in a low, sorrowful voice. She would never be able to become a mother. Brooke went on, her voice light and careless, as if she were talking about the weather. "That was your fate anyway. You already sacrificed yourself for me once, so what's one more sacrifice? Why should I suffer when you don't really have anything left to lose?" Paige looked at her sister, and it felt as though a hand had closed tightly around her heart. Not because of Brooke's words, but because of the way she said them, without a shred of regret, without a trace of shame, as if Paige's pain were only some tiny detail too unimportant to matter. She thought of Wesley, the man she loved after the accident. He had stayed with her for 2 years, telling her he loved her, telling her he didn't care whether she could have children or not. Then one day, he left. No explanation, no goodbye message. He was simply gone. Paige only learned the truth much later. Brooke had accidentally told Wesley about her condition during a family dinner. "She can't have children, you know. It's so sad. Are you really sure you want to tie yourself for life to someone like that?" Wesley left soon after, and Brooke had never apologized. Now, looking at her sister lying there in that hospital bed, speaking such vicious words with a smile on her lips, Paige understood that some things never changed. She stood up. Gerald hurriedly said, "Paige, you don't have to." "Fine." Paige cut him off, her voice calmer than it had any right to be. "I'll go." Brooke gave the faintest smile of triumph. Gerald looked as though someone had just struck him in the stomach. He opened his mouth, wanting to say something. Perhaps an apology. Perhaps an explanation. Perhaps a plea for his older daughter not to do this. But Paige had already turned and walked out of the hospital room. She didn't cry. She had forgotten how to cry a long time ago. 3 days later, Paige received an envelope in the mail. Inside was nothing but a single sheet of white paper with one neatly typed line on it. An address in Marshfield, a coastal town about an hour's drive from Boston. There was no greeting, no instruction, no signature, only an address, cold and final as a sentence handed down without appeal. She began packing her things in the small apartment in South Boston. There wasn't much to take. A few sets of clothes, a few books, an old photo album from when her mother was still alive. She folded each item slowly and carefully, as though she were packing up her entire life into one small suitcase. No one came to help her. No one called to ask if she needed anything. The little apartment felt emptier than ever, and Paige realized that she had been living like this for years without truly noticing it. Alone. Always alone. On the morning she left, Gerald came to see her off. He stood at the door, his eyes red-rimmed, his hands clasped together as if he didn't know where else to put them. He looked older than he had the week before, as if guilt were gnawing at him from the inside out. "Paige," he called when she stepped out with her suitcase. "I'm sorry." Paige stopped and looked at the man who had once been a hero in her eyes when she was little, the man who had taught her how to ride a bicycle, who had lifted her onto his shoulders so she could watch fireworks, who had promised that he'd always protect her. Now he stood before her with pleading eyes, but Paige had nothing left to say. She gave him a faint nod, then turned and walked away. Brooke didn't come out to say goodbye. She was busy trying on wedding dresses with Spencer Whitmore in an elegant shop on Newbury Street. Her dream wedding would take place in a few months, and Brooke didn't have time to trouble herself over who her sister was being handed over to. Paige wasn't surprised. She had stopped expecting anything from her sister a long time ago. As Boston dissolved in her rearview mirror like a fading dream, Paige felt no urge to cry. She had long ago run out of tears for a life that treated her as an afterthought. On the road, she thought about what little she knew of the Grey Wolf. No one knew what his face looked like. People said he controlled the harbor, the real estate, and many other things that were only spoken of in whispers after dark. They said he was cold as ice and never forgave betrayal. The people who displeased him vanished without a trace, as though they had never existed at all. Some said he killed without even blinking. Others said he was the devil wearing the shape of a man. Paige wondered how long she would survive beside someone like that. A month, a year, or only a few days before she too disappeared like the others. She shook her head and forced the dark thoughts away. In any case, there wasn't much about her old life worth mourning. A dull job, an empty apartment, a family that treated her like an afterthought. Maybe dying at the hands of the Grey Wolf wouldn't be worse than the life she already had. She reached Marshfield just as evening fell, staining the sky red like blood. This little town was nothing like Boston, so quiet that Paige could hear the distant echo of the sea. The streets were nearly empty, and wooden houses stood scattered among the deep green pine woods. She followed the address on the paper down winding roads until she finally stopped in front of a massive iron gate. It stood nearly 10 feet high, black as night, its curved bars twisted into a strange and almost forbidding shape. As the gate opened, Paige took a deep breath and drove onto the gravel road, which wound through a dense forest of towering pines that stood like silent guards in the growing shadows. The red light of the setting sun filtered through the leaves, casting strange, dreamlike streaks across the road. Paige drove past the gate, and she had the unmistakable feeling that she had just crossed into another world, a place where ordinary rules no longer existed. The gravel road led Paige to a large wooden house standing in the middle of the pine forest, facing the sea. The house was so beautiful that she had to stop the car for a moment just to take it in. It was 2 stories tall, with a steep roof covered in green moss and wide glass windows that mirrored the bleeding sky. Behind the house, the sea stretched all the way to the horizon, the waves brushing softly against the rocky shore in a steady rhythm like a lullaby. She stepped inside and was surprised to find the door unlocked. The house was a masterpiece of rustic luxury, from the gleaming oak floors to the marble fireplace. Every detail seemed designed to comfort her, though the heavy silence reminded her she was utterly alone. Paige walked through the house, calling out to see if anyone could hear her. Only the echo of her own voice answered back from the walls. She stopped at the dining table, where a white note had been placed neatly in the center. "Food is in the refrigerator. Bedroom upstairs. Make yourself at home." No signature, no greeting, no explanation. Paige picked up the note and stared at the neat, even lettering, cold and impersonal. She didn't know what she was supposed to feel. Relief because she didn't have to face the gray wolf right away, or fear because she had no idea where he was or what he was doing. The first week in Marshfield was a ghost-like existence. Between the delivery man's silent knocks and the distant roar of engines at night, Paige felt less like a bride and more like a ghost haunting a luxury prison. What chilled her even more was how the house seemed to know her. The shelves were stocked with her favorite mystery novels, and the kitchen held the exact ingredients for her comfort meals. Someone was watching, studying her every preference from the shadows of the pines. On the third night, Paige stood by the bedroom window looking out at the dark sea. A full moon hung in the sky, spilling silver light across the black water. The wind moved through the pine trees, making a soft whispering sound like voices just beyond reach. Then she saw it. A black car was parked in the distance near the edge of the forest. Its headlights were off, but in the faint moonlight she could make out the shape of someone sitting inside. The person didn't get out of the car, didn't come to knock on the door, just sat there in the dark, staring toward the house. Staring toward her. Paige stood still by the window, her heart beating faster. She didn't know whether she was being imprisoned or protected, but one thing she knew for certain: someone was waiting for her, and that person knew far more about her than she had ever imagined. On the morning of the fourth day, a knock came at the door. Paige jolted awake, her heart beating fast. For the past 3 days, no one had knocked. The delivery man had only left the food by the door and walked away. She went downstairs, hesitating for a moment before opening it. Standing in front of her was an older woman, perhaps around 60. Her silver hair was pinned up neatly in a high bun. Her brown eyes were warm as sunlit honey, and her smile was so gentle that Paige almost wondered if she was dreaming. The woman wore a cream-colored sweater and carried a wicker basket filled with fresh vegetables. "You must be Paige," she said, her voice soft as a spring breeze. "I'm Maggie. I'm sorry it took me so long to come." Paige stood there, not knowing what to say. What had the woman just said? Sorry it took her so long? Maggie didn't wait to be invited in. She walked straight into the house as if this were a place she came to every day. She set the wicker basket on the kitchen table, then turned to look at Paige with eyes that observed without judging. "You look exhausted. Have you been sleeping well these past few days?" Who are you?" Paige finally managed to ask. Maggie smiled softly. "I already told you. I'm Maggie, Reed's adoptive mother." Paige froze. His adoptive mother? The gray wolf had a mother? She had always imagined that a man feared by all of Boston must have been born straight out of hell, with no family, no one of his own, nothing but darkness and power. But standing before her was a woman who looked like the kind grandmother from an old fairy tale. "Did you think he came out of stone?" Maggie said, as if she had read Paige's thoughts. "He was raised by someone too. He was loved too. No matter what the world calls him, to me, he's still my son." She made tea, set 2 cups on the table, then sat down across from Paige. Every movement she made was natural and easy, as though she had done this 1,000 times before. "I'm sorry you had to stay here alone for the past 3 days," Maggie said. "My son isn't good at this sort of thing. He thought giving you space was the best way. He thought you needed time to adjust, but I didn't agree. A girl arriving in a strange place needs someone to talk to, doesn't she?" Paige picked up the teacup and took a sip. The warmth of the tea spread down her throat, easing some of the tension she had been carrying for days. Can you tell me about him? About Reed? I adopted him when he was 10, Maggie said, her eyes drifting far away as though looking back into another life. I used to be a nurse at the city hospital. His mother died, and he had no one left. I saw him, I loved him, and so I brought him home. She paused and took a sip of tea. My son isn't good at showing emotion. He's cold, quiet, and there are things he never shares with me. But he isn't a bad man. He's just different. Give him time. Give him a chance to let you see who he really is. Paige didn't know whether she should believe her or not, but there was something in Maggie's voice, in her eyes, that made Paige feel warmer than she had in days. Before she left, Maggie took Paige's hand, and her hand was warm and dry, just like her mother's used to be. Give him a chance, and give yourself one too. When Maggie left, Paige stood at the window and watched her go. The woman's car disappeared beyond the line of pines, leaving the familiar stillness behind. But the house no longer felt quite as empty as it had before. Paige found herself wondering, This woman loved the monster as if he were her own child. So could it be possible that he wasn't entirely a monster after all? 2 days after her meeting with Maggie, Paige was taken to an old seaside church. Maggie came to pick her up early in the morning, carrying a simple white dress wrapped carefully in a cloth garment bag. "I chose this for you," she said with a faint smile. "Not too elaborate, but beautiful, like you." Paige put on the dress and looked at herself in the mirror. It fell all the way to her heels, fitted closely at the waist before flaring softly, made of smooth ivory silk. There were no stones, no embroidered lace, yet it was elegant in its own quiet way. She looked like a real bride, even though she knew this wasn't a wedding born of love. The church stood on a small hill overlooking the sea, built from gray stone weathered by time. The stained glass windows filtered the afternoon sunlight into shimmering bands of color across the stone floor. The faint scent of incense lingered in the air. Inside, the church was almost empty. Only Maggie sat in the front pew. An elderly priest stood before the altar, and 2 men in black suits stood some distance away in the back. There were no flowers, no music, no guests. This didn't look like any wedding Paige had ever imagined. She stood at the end of the aisle, her heart beating so fast she could hear it in her ears. She didn't know what to do, how to walk, or where she should look. Then the door behind the altar opened. He stepped inside. Reed Kincaid, the Grey Wolf, the man no one in Boston dared to speak of by name. He was taller than she had imagined, perhaps close to 6'3". His shoulders were broad, his back straight, and every step carried the quiet confidence of a man accustomed to controlling everything around him. His black hair was cut short and neat, his jaw square, his nose straight. A faint scar ran from his temple to near his left ear, like the mark of a past that had never known peace. He wore a black suit, with the top of his shirt left unbuttoned, revealing the line of his throat and collarbone. He didn't look like a man about to marry a wife. He looked like a king walking into his own domain. But what made Paige forget how to breathe were his eyes. Dark gray like a winter storm, cold and fathomless. When he looked at her, Paige felt as though he were seeing straight through her, as if he could read every thought inside her mind. But there was something in those eyes that made her go still. Familiarity, as though they had met somewhere before, as though he had known her already. Paige gave the slightest shake of her head, pushing away the absurd thought. She had never met this man. How could he possibly feel familiar? The ceremony moved quickly, without show or spectacle. The priest recited the familiar words, the ones Paige had heard hundreds of times in films, but now they sounded distant and cold. There were no vows of love, no promises of forever, only a legal ritual completed in silence. Reed slid a simple silver ring onto her finger, with no stone and no design. She placed a matching one on his. The 2 rings were identical, cold against the skin. "Do you take this woman to be your wife?" the priest asked. "I do," Reed answered, his voice low and unreadable. "Do you take this man to be your husband?" "I do," Paige said, her voice trembling slightly even though she tried to control it. The priest smiled. "I now pronounce you husband and wife. The groom may kiss the bride." But Reed didn't kiss her. He only stood there, looking at her for a long moment. Those eyes moved slowly over her face, from her forehead to her eyes, from her nose to her lips, as though he were committing every feature to memory. Then he gave the slightest nod and turned away, walking out of the church. Not a word, not a smile, not a touch. Paige stood there, watching his back disappear beyond the door, feeling strangely hollow inside. Maggie came to her side and took her hand gently. "Come on, daughter-in-law. Let's go home." Paige walked out of the church as the wife of the Grey Wolf, and she still hadn't heard him speak a single word to her beyond "I do." They returned to the wooden house in silence. Throughout the entire drive, Reed didn't say a word, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Paige sat in the passenger seat, with her hands clasped tightly together, trying not to let him see that she was trembling. The silver ring on her finger felt cold as ice, a constant reminder that everything that had just happened was real. She was married, to the Grey Wolf, to the man all of Boston feared. By the time the car stopped in front of the house, darkness had already swallowed the pine forest. Only the soft yellow light from the first-floor windows glowed through the night, like a lighthouse in the middle of a black sea. Reed got out first and walked around to open the door for her. It was an unexpectedly polite gesture, but he didn't look at her, didn't touch her. He only stood there, waiting for her to step out, then turned and headed toward the front door. Paige followed behind him, her heart beating wildly. She didn't know what would happen tonight. She had heard enough terrible stories about women forced to marry powerful men, wedding nights that became nightmares, brides who turned into prisoners inside their own homes. She wondered if she would become one of them. They went upstairs in silence. Reed's footsteps sounded steady and even against the wooden floor, while Paige's were light and hesitant, like a frightened stray cat. He stopped in front of a door, placed his hand on the knob, then turned to look at her. "This is your room." Paige looked at the door, then back at him. She didn't understand. Reed opened it and stepped aside so she could see inside. The room was spacious and warm, with a large bed covered in white blankets, a window facing the sea, and an armchair placed beside a bookshelf. A bedside lamp had already been turned on, casting a soft and gentle glow. Paige stepped inside, her heart still racing. She turned back and saw Reed still standing at the threshold, not following her in. "My room is at the end of the hall," he said, his voice low and clear. "This door doesn't have a lock. You can go anywhere in the house, at any time, but this room is yours. I won't enter unless you give me permission." Paige stood there, her lips parting in surprise. She had prepared herself for the worst, but not for this, not for respect, not for distance. "Why?" she asked, her voice rough with tension. Reed looked at her for a long moment, his eyes impossible to read. Then he spoke, slowly, as though weighing every word. "I didn't marry you for revenge, and I didn't marry you to have someone serve me." Paige swallowed hard. "Then why did you marry me?" Silence. The sound of the ocean wind moved past the window, carrying with it the scent of salt and damp air. Reed stood there, his shadow stretched long across the wooden floor, his face half lit and half hidden in the hallway light. Then he said, so softly that Paige almost didn't hear him, "Because I've been waiting for you for a very long time." Before she could ask another question, he had already turned and walked away. His tall figure disappeared into the darkness at the end of the hall, and Paige heard the door to his room close, gently, not slammed. Paige leaned against the closed door, his words waiting for you searing into her mind. They were strangers, yet he looked at her with a soul-deep recognition she couldn't explain. Paige closed the bedroom door and leaned back against it, taking one long, unsteady breath. She looked around the room, at the white bed, at the moonlight slowly rising beyond the window. Then she changed clothes, climbed into bed, and lay there staring up at the ceiling. Her wedding night passed in solitude. There was no kiss, no embrace, none of the things people always whispered about when they spoke of a husband and wife on their first night. But strangely, she didn't feel afraid. She felt confused, curious, and something else she didn't dare name. That night, Paige lay in bed staring at the ceiling, and in the quiet of her own mind, she asked herself the same question again and again. He had been waiting for her? Since when? And why? In the weeks that followed, Paige's life became so strange that she didn't know how she was supposed to respond to it. She lived in the large wooden house in the middle of the pine forest, with everything she could possibly need provided for her, free to move about the vast grounds as she pleased. And yet she almost never saw her husband. Reed was hardly ever there. He left early in the morning while she was still asleep, and returned at midnight when she had already gone to her room. There were days when he vanished entirely, without a sound, without a trace. Paige only knew he still existed through the sound of a car late at night, and the faint light glowing from the study on the first floor. But the strange thing was that every day she noticed small things. A new book on the table by the window, exactly from the mystery author she had been following. A vase of fresh flowers placed in the corner of the living room, white carnations, the same kind she had once told Maggie were her mother's favorite. A soft blue wool scarf folded neatly on the armchair, in the exact shade she always chose whenever she bought clothes. Paige didn't understand how Reed knew these things. She had barely spoken to him. In truth, she hadn't exchanged more than 10 sentences with him since the wedding day. But someone was listening. Someone was watching. Someone was trying to make her feel comfortable in the quietest way possible. Maggie visited often, bringing fresh vegetables from the market and stories about the town. She taught Paige how to cook local dishes, told her about the few neighbors scattered nearby, about the sea and the pine forest and the bitterly cold winters in Marshfield. Little by little, Paige began to grow used to her new life. She woke each morning, made coffee, and read by the window overlooking the sea. She cooked alone, walked through the pine forest, listened to the waves breaking against the rocks. Life wasn't bad, It was only lonely. One evening, Paige stayed up late reading because she couldn't sleep. Around 1 o'clock in the morning, she heard a car return. The engine went quiet, the car door shut. Then came the heavy sound of footsteps on the gravel. She set down her book and slipped quietly into the hallway, looking down toward the first floor over the stair railing. Reed's study had glass doors, and from where she stood, Paige could see him inside. Alone, in the dark, he sat in a leather chair with a glass of liquor in his hand, staring into the empty space ahead of him. No lamp was on. Only moonlight filtered through the window and cast shadows across his face. In that moment, Reed didn't look like the powerful boss all of Boston feared. He didn't look like the gray wolf with eyes cold as ice. He looked like a tired man carrying too much weight on his shoulders, enduring something alone in the middle of the night. Paige wanted to go downstairs, wanted to ask if he was all right, wanted to speak to him for the first time since their wedding night, but she didn't dare. She went back to her room, closed the door softly, and lay down on the bed, but she couldn't sleep. He was cold, distant, mysterious, but there was something in those eyes that Paige couldn't stop thinking about. About 2 months after the wedding, there came a night when Paige couldn't sleep. She lay in bed restless and wide awake, listening to the distant sound of the sea rolling in from far away. The clock showed nearly 2 o'clock in the morning, but her mind was as alert as it would have been in broad daylight. She decided to go outside and breathe in the night air. Paige pulled on her wool sweater, went downstairs, and stepped out onto the back porch. The night was cold, and the wind coming off the sea carried the scent of salt and dampness. She stood there for a while, looking up at the sky crowded with stars, trying to empty her mind. Then she heard something, from the direction of the pine forest, farther off toward the old storage shed she had noticed during her walks. Low voices, footsteps, and a dim light slipping through the cracks in the wooden door. Paige knew she shouldn't go there. She knew it could be dangerous. But curiosity was stronger than reason. She wanted to know what Reed did at night. She wanted to understand the man she had married. She slipped between the pine trunks, her steps light as a cat across the layer of dry needles. The shed came into view, an old wooden structure with a rusted tin roof. Yellow light leaked through the narrow gaps between the planks. She pressed herself against the wall and looked through a thin crack in the door. Inside, Reed was sitting on a wooden chair, one leg crossed over the other, at ease as though he were in his own living room. Across from him was a middle-aged man, pale with fear, while 2 men dressed in black stood on either side gripping his shoulders. Reed was speaking to him. His voice was calm, steady, as though he were discussing the weather or the price of stocks. Paige couldn't hear every word clearly, but she could see the other man's reaction. He was trembling. Sweat ran down his face. He said something in a voice that sounded like pleading, but Reed only gave a slight shake of his head. Reed wasn't angry. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten with words, but there was something in the way he spoke, in those cold gray eyes, that made the man more terrified than any shouted threat ever could have. It was the calm of someone who held the power of life and death in his hands. Paige stepped back, her heart pounding wildly. Her foot came down on a dry branch, and the sharp crack split through the stillness of the night. Reed turned his head. His eyes cut straight through the dark, looking exactly at the place where she stood. Paige didn't wait another second. She turned and ran through the pine forest, ran back to the wooden house, ran upstairs to her room and locked the door. She trembled through the entire night, curled tight on the bed while the image of what she had seen replayed over and over in her mind. That was Reed, her husband, the gray wolf. And now she had seen why all of Boston feared even speaking his name. The next morning, Paige came down to the kitchen later than usual. She hadn't slept at all, and dark shadows lay beneath her eyes from exhaustion and fear. When she stepped into the dining room, she stopped short. Reed was sitting at the breakfast table. For the first time in weeks, he had appeared in daylight. He was wearing a white shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, drinking coffee as though nothing had happened the night before. Paige stood at the doorway, not knowing whether she should move forward or back away. Reed didn't look up. He only said, his voice even and calm, "Sit down. Eat breakfast." She sat across from him, her hands trembling slightly as she picked up her glass of orange juice. Silence stretched between them. Then Reed set down his coffee cup and looked straight into her eyes. "You saw?" It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Paige didn't deny it. She couldn't lie to those eyes that seemed to see straight through her. Reed wasn't angry. He didn't threaten her. He only continued, his voice holding not the slightest trace of excuse. That man promised people he'd help them reach a better life. Then he abandoned them. Too many families trusted him and lost everything. He rose from his chair and pushed it back. Before walking away, he paused without turning around. "You have every right to be afraid of me. I'm not a good man." Then he was gone. Paige sat there, watching his back disappear beyond the door, her thoughts hopelessly tangled. She was afraid. But the strange thing was, she wasn't afraid that he would hurt her. She was afraid because she no longer knew what she was beginning to feel for this man. 2 weeks had passed since the night Paige witnessed what happened in the shed. 14 days she had lived in the wooden house with that image haunting her mind. 14 nights she had lain awake in bed, asking herself who she was living with, what kind of world she had been pulled into. Reed never mentioned that night again. He went on disappearing during the day and returning at midnight as he always did. The small gifts still appeared. New books, fresh flowers, the little things she liked. But now, every time she saw them, Paige no longer felt warmth. She felt fear. Fear because someone was watching her every move. Fear because she didn't know what line Reed was willing to cross. Fear because she was beginning to grow used to this life, and that frightened her more than anything else. On the 15th day, Paige decided to run. She couldn't go on living like this forever, not knowing who she was living with, not knowing what tomorrow would bring, not knowing whether one day she might become like the man in the shed. She had to leave. Paige took the cash from her handbag, a few $100s she had brought with her from Boston. It wasn't much, but it was enough to buy a bus ticket back to the city. After that, she would figure the rest out. Maybe she would find a new job, a new apartment, a new life somewhere no one knew who she was. She called a taxi on her phone, surprised that she had a signal and that a car was willing to come all the way out there. She stood waiting by the gate, her heart beating fast, her eyes constantly flicking back toward the house to see if anyone was watching her. The taxi arrived, an ordinary yellow cab. The driver, a middle-aged man with a kind face. Paige slid into the back seat and let out a breath of relief. "Take me to the nearest bus station," she said. The car drove on, through the iron gate, out to the main road, across the quiet little town of Marshfield. 5 minutes passed. Paige began to relax, thinking she had gotten away. Then the car stopped. In the middle of the road, there was no red light, no obstacle ahead. It simply stopped. Paige looked up, confused. "What's wrong?" The driver turned around, his face unreadable. His eyes were colder than she expected. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Kincaid. I can't take you any farther." Paige went still. Mrs. Kincaid. He knew who she was. He belonged to Reed. Or Reed controlled everything that came in and out of this place. Even harmless-looking taxis. She couldn't escape. She had never truly been able to escape. Paige opened the car door and stepped out onto the empty road. Around her there was nothing but fields and pine forest. Not another soul in sight. The wind blew cold, carrying the scent of the sea from far away. She stood there, not knowing what to do, feeling like an animal cornered with nowhere left to run. Then she heard the sound of an engine behind her. A familiar black car pulled up a few meters away. The door opened. Reed stepped out. He was wearing a black coat, his hair slightly tousled by the wind, his eyes fixed on her. He wasn't angry. He didn't shout. There was nothing in him of a man who had just caught his prey trying to flee. He only stood there a few steps away from her in silence. Then he spoke, his voice calm in a way that felt almost unreal. "If you want to leave, I'll take you to the airport. I'll give you money, anything you need to start over." Paige stared at him in shock. She had prepared herself for anger, for threats, for anything a mafia boss might do when his wife tried to run away, but not this. "You'd let me go?" she asked, unable to hide her surprise. "I didn't marry you to imprison you," Reed replied. "If you don't want to stay here, I won't keep you. You can go anywhere you want. I won't look for you. I won't take revenge on your family. You'll be free." Paige stood there with the wind blowing her hair loose around her face, her thoughts in chaos. She didn't know whether to believe him. She didn't know whether this was real or just another psychological game. Reed continued, his voice lower now. "But before you decide, give me 5 minutes. Just 5 minutes. Let me explain one thing." She looked at him. Looked into the gray eyes that were holding her without blinking. And for the first time, what she saw there wasn't the coldness of the gray wolf. It wasn't the calculation of a kingpin. It was waiting, as if he were placing his entire heart inside whatever answer she gave him next. Reed opened the passenger side door and motioned for Paige to get in. She hesitated for a moment, but then stepped inside. He drove away, not back to the wooden house, but toward an empty coastal road. He stopped at a place overlooking the ocean, where the waves brushed softly against the rocks, and the wind carried the sharp scent of salt. They sat in the car in silence for a long while. Paige looked out at the sea, feeling the rhythm of the waves like the heartbeat of someone breathing slow and steady. Reed sat beside her with both hands resting on the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the horizon as well. Then he began to speak. I took over the Kincaid organization from my biological father when I was 17. His voice was low and unhurried, as though he were telling a story he had buried deep for a very long time. My father was a cold man with no limits. He trafficked everything, hurt everyone, and didn't care about the consequences. To him, people were only tools, even family. Paige turned to look at him and saw the way his jaw tightened, the scar at his temple seeming darker in the fading light. My mother wanted to leave. Reed continued. She wanted to take me away from that life. She wanted us to have an ordinary life somewhere else. But my father didn't allow it. He said no one was allowed to leave the Kincaid family. No one. He paused and took a slow, deep breath. One night, my mother never came back. Paige felt her heart tighten painfully in her chest. She didn't need Reed to explain any further to understand what had happened. The woman who wanted to protect her son had been erased by her own husband. I was 17, Reed said, in a tone so detached it sounded as though he were telling someone else's story. I knew what my father had done. I confronted him, and that night, my father left this world for good. He lifted a hand to the scar on his face, his fingers brushing lightly over the rough line of damaged skin. This is the only thing he left me. Paige sat there, not knowing what she could possibly say. She was listening to the story of a 17-year-old boy who had faced a devil, who had done what no one that age should ever have to do, in order to protect himself and avenge his mother. Reed looked out at the sea, the waves breaking against the rocks in a steady rhythm like the long sigh of the ocean itself. After that night, I rebuilt this organization with my own rules. No drug trafficking, no harming innocent people. I control the harbor, the real estate, and many other things, but I have my lines. Paige finally spoke. Then the man in the shed? He drove too many families into ruin. Reed answered, his voice turning colder. He promised people he would help them, then abandoned them after taking all their money. Some lost their homes. Some lost every cent they had saved in an entire lifetime. I don't forgive men like that. Paige fell silent, trying to absorb everything she had just heard. She remembered Reed's eyes in the shed, the cold stillness in him as he spoke to that man. Now she understood it wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was justice in his own way. Reed turned to look at her, his eyes deep and unreadable. I'm not a good man, Paige. I'll never pretend to be one. But I have my lines, and I will never become my father. Paige looked at him, and saw in those eyes a kind of resolve she had never seen in anyone before. She asked, her voice softer now. Then why did you marry me? Reed didn't answer right away. He looked at her for a long time, as if weighing how much he should say, how much he should reveal. Then he spoke, quietly. It isn't time to tell you yet, but one day, you'll understand. He turned back toward the sea, and with that, the conversation came to an end. Paige didn't ask any more questions. She sat there, watching the waves break against the shore, feeling the sea wind drift through the slightly open window. She thought about everything Reed had told her, about the 17-year-old boy who had lost his mother, about the man sitting beside her now with the scar on his face and the rules he had built for himself. He wasn't a good man. He admitted that himself. But he wasn't the monster she had once imagined either. Paige didn't go back to Boston, not because she was forced to stay, but because, for the first time, she wanted to remain and understand the man sitting beside her. 1 week after their conversation by the sea, Reed came to find Paige in the morning. She was sitting by the window reading when she heard a knock on her bedroom door. She opened it and was surprised to see him standing there. Usually, he was already gone at dawn, and she only ever heard the sound of his car returning at midnight. Put on something comfortable, Reed said, his voice brief as always. Meet me in the backyard in 10 minutes. Then he turned and walked away without another explanation. Paige stood there for a moment, confused. She changed into a simple set of exercise clothes, tied her hair back neatly, then went downstairs to the backyard. Reed was already waiting for her there, dressed in a black t-shirt and comfortable pants. He looked entirely different from the image of the cold man in a black suit she had grown used to seeing. "You live with me now," he said, getting straight to the point. "That means there will be people who may try to use you to hurt me. I need you to know how to protect yourself." Paige blinked. "You want to teach me self-defense?" "I want to teach you how to get away if something happens," Reed replied. "Not so you can fight anyone, so you can stay alive long enough for help to reach you." They began. Reed taught her how to survive. He showed her how to break a grip, how to find her voice in a moment of terror, and how to run toward safety. For the first time, Paige didn't feel like a victim. She felt like a fighter. How to run and find safety, always toward people, toward light, toward cameras. Reed was more patient than she had imagined. He explained each step clearly, demonstrating slowly so she could see. Whenever he needed to touch her to guide her, he asked first, and he never touched her more than necessary. His hand closed around her wrist gently, enough for her to understand the movement, but never enough to frighten her. "Try again," he said when she did it wrong. Not shouting, not criticizing, just those two calm, patient words. Paige tried again. This time she turned the right way and pulled her hand free from his grip. Reed gave a small nod, and his eyes softened just a little. He didn't praise her out loud, but she understood it for what it was. Recognition. They practiced for nearly an hour. Sweat began to gather on Paige's forehead, but she didn't feel tired. She felt alive. It was the first time she and Reed had spent time together without tension hanging between them. There was no darkness from the shed, no unanswered questions, only the morning sun, the sea wind, and two people learning how to trust each other a little at a time. Paige began to see another side of Reed. Not the cold boss all of Boston feared, not the gray wolf with eyes like ice, but a man who was trying to protect her in the only way he knew how. He wasn't good with sweet words. He didn't know how to bring flowers or write love letters, but he was teaching her how to survive. For Reed, perhaps that was the way he showed he cared. When the training ended, Reed handed her a bottle of water. "Tomorrow we continue," he said, then turned and walked back toward the house. Paige watched him go, watched that tall figure disappear behind the door, and she realized she was smiling. For the first time in a very long while, 4 months had passed since the day Paige arrived in Marshfield. Her life had changed in ways she never could have imagined. She had slowly grown used to the wooden house in the middle of the pine forest, grown used to the sound of the sea each morning, grown used to the self-defense lessons with Reed and the afternoons spent cooking with Maggie. She still didn't fully understand her mysterious husband, but she was no longer afraid the way she had been in those first days. One morning, Maggie arrived with an unusual expression on her face. She wasn't carrying vegetables or cheerful little stories about the town the way she usually did. She sat down across from Paige, her brown eyes thoughtful and heavy. "Have you heard anything about the Whitmore family?" Paige shook her head. She had cut off all contact with Boston from the day she left. She didn't call her father, didn't text Brooke, didn't follow any news from the city she had once called home. "The FBI is investigating Spencer Whitmore for financial fraud," Maggie said. "The Whitmore Company is on the edge of collapse. This news is all over the papers in Boston." Paige sat still, unsure what she was supposed to feel. Spencer Whitmore, the only son of a powerful, wealthy family, the man Brooke had chosen instead of being forced to marry the gray wolf, the perfect life her sister had boasted about was falling apart. Maggie went on. "Brooke is living in the Whitmore mansion on Beacon Hill, but she's only a decoration there. Spencer doesn't let her touch the money. Everything is in his name. If the company falls, she'll have nothing." Paige was silent. She remembered that day in the hospital room when Brooke had smiled with smug triumph and said her future would be mansions and diamonds. She remembered the way her sister had called her useless, discarded, worth nothing. And now that mansion was on the verge of being seized, and those diamonds were only meaningless stones once the money was gone. That evening, Reed came home earlier than usual. He sat across from Paige in the living room, a cup of coffee in his hand. "You've heard the news about Whitmore," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, Spencer Whitmore is a fraud." Reed continued, his voice calm and even. "He used investors' money to fund a luxurious life, then falsified the books to cover it up. But he isn't only a fraud. He's also a bad man. He had someone else on the side even before he married your sister. Paige wasn't surprised. She had sensed that a long time ago, from the way Spencer looked at Brooke as if she were a decorative possession rather than a wife. Reed looked at her, his eyes unreadable as ever. Your sister is going to lose everything soon. When that happens, what do you want me to do? Paige answered without hesitation. Nothing. That was her choice. Reed gave a slow nod and said nothing more, but in his eyes, Paige saw a trace of respect, as if she had just passed some test he had never spoken aloud. 1 month after the news of the investigation broke, Spencer Whitmore was officially arrested. The FBI had gathered more than enough evidence of financial fraud, the embezzlement of investor money, and falsified records stretching back for years. The Whitmore Company declared bankruptcy. The mansion on Beacon Hill was seized. The million-dollar cars were impounded. And Brooke Holloway, or rather Brooke Whitmore, was thrown out into the street. She filed for divorce immediately, hoping to keep at least something from the ruins of the marriage. But Spencer's lawyer presented the prenuptial agreement she had signed before the wedding. In her dizzy hunger for money and status, Brooke had signed it without reading the details carefully. She wasn't entitled to a single piece of property. She walked out of the marriage with exactly what she had brought into it. Nothing. Brooke returned to Gerald's house, the old crumbling place on the outskirts of Boston, but her father had nothing left to give her either. After Paige left, Gerald had lived alone, sick and sinking deeper into poverty. The gambling debt had been erased because of Paige's marriage, but he had no savings left, no job, nothing but the decaying house and the remorse that followed him every night. Brooke looked around that miserable house, looked at her aging father coughing in the corner of the room, and rage rose inside her. Why had her life become this? Why should she be the one suffering while Paige was out there living in comfort with the gray wolf? Her sister, the one Brooke had once called useless, was now living in a great house in the middle of the pine forest, protected by the most powerful man on the East Coast. And Brooke? She had nothing left at all. In her desperation, Brooke did the most foolish thing she had ever done in her life. She found a way to contact one of Reed's rival groups in New York. Through old social connections from her days moving through wealthy circles, she managed to reach them. She gave them information about where Reed lived, about the routes he usually took, about the security system around the wooden house in Marshfield, and most importantly, she told them about Paige, the Grey Wolf's wife, the only weakness of a man no one had ever been able to touch. In return, they promised her money. A great deal of money. Brooke thought she was being clever. If something happened to Reed, Paige would become a widow, and a rich widow would be much easier to manipulate. Brooke would come back, pretend to be sorry, pretend to love her sister, then slowly take everything Paige inherited. She had done the same kind of thing with Wesley years before. She believed she could do it again. But Brooke didn't know one thing. The Kincaid organization had eyes everywhere. The people she contacted, the phone calls she made, the messages she sent, all of it was being watched. Reed discovered the plan before it ever had the chance to happen. One night, Brooke was sitting in a shabby rented apartment in Boston when there came a knock at the door. She opened it, and her heart nearly stopped. Reed Kincaid stood there alone, his gray eyes cold as ice. He stepped inside without waiting to be invited. Brooke backed away, her legs shaking, her mouth opening, but no words came out. Reed didn't threaten her with raised voices or angry words. He didn't need to. He only stood there, looking at her, his tone as calm as if he were discussing the weather. "You're my wife's sister. That's the only reason you're still standing here. But if there's a next time, I won't need a reason." Brooke trembled and couldn't bring herself to look into his eyes. She wanted to say something, wanted to explain, wanted to apologize, but her throat felt locked shut. Reed turned and walked out without another word. The door closed behind him, leaving Brooke standing alone in the dark room. She had no idea that what she had done had just set in motion a chain of events no one could yet imagine. 1 week after the night Reed went to see Brooke, Paige learned something by accident from Maggie. During an afternoon spent cooking together, Maggie casually mentioned that Reed's birthday was coming soon. "My son never celebrates his birthday," Maggie said, and there was a quiet sadness in her voice. "From the time he was little until now, he hasn't liked anyone bringing up that day. But I still make him apple cake every year. It was the dessert his birth mother used to make." Paige tucked the date away in her mind and said nothing. She wanted to do something for Reed, a small gift to thank him for everything he had done for her. He had taught her how to defend herself, given her space of her own, respected her in a way no one ever had before. She wanted him to know that she treasured that. On Reed's birthday, she decided to go out alone. She knew she shouldn't. She knew the security team always watched every movement in and out of the area. But she wanted this to be a surprise. If she told anyone, Reed would know immediately. Paige drove into the town of Marshfield, along the familiar road she had traveled many times with Maggie. The town was small and peaceful, with shops lined close together along the main street. She stopped in front of a small watch shop she had noticed before and went inside. The owner was an elderly man with silver hair who greeted her warmly. Paige looked around until her eyes settled on a silver watch that was simple yet finely made. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't ornate. It felt exactly like Reed. She bought the watch, carefully placed it in its box, and stepped back outside with a smile on her lips. She didn't notice the two men standing beside her car. When she came closer, one of them stepped forward, a smile on his mouth, but eyes as cold as knives. "Mrs. Kincaid? Someone wants to meet you." Paige took a step back, and the survival instinct Reed had taught her sprang to life at once. She opened her mouth to scream, but a hand clamped hard over it from behind. A sharp chemical smell flooded her nose. Everything went black. When Paige woke up, she had no idea where she was. The room had no windows, only a single yellow bulb hanging from the ceiling and giving off a weak, sickly light. Her hands were bound behind her back with plastic ties pulled so tight that her wrists had gone numb. She was sitting on a cold concrete floor with her back against a damp wall. She tried to stay calm, tried to remember what Reed had taught her. Observe your surroundings. Look for a way out. Survive. The room had only one iron door. There was nothing she could use as a weapon. No crack, no opening, no way to escape. She was sealed inside. The door opened. Two men walked in, one of them holding a phone. They spoke in English marked by a New York accent, and Paige understood immediately who they were. Reed's rivals, the men Brooke had contacted. "Your husband wants to talk," one of them said, then turned on speakerphone. Reed's voice came through, cold and sharp as a blade. "If you touch her, you'll wish you'd never been born." The man gave a mocking laugh. "Grey Wolf, we want money, and we want you out of Boston Harbor. Otherwise your wife will." "You have 12 hours, Reed cut in, his voice steady and without the slightest tremor. "After that, I'm coming, and I won't be coming to negotiate." The call ended. The two men looked at each other, their faces no longer carrying the confidence they had before. They walked out and shut the door again, leaving Paige alone in the dark. She sat there for hours. She didn't know whether it was day or night anymore. She didn't know where Reed was or what he was doing. She was afraid, but she didn't cry. She remembered the self-defense lessons in the backyard, remembered Reed's calm voice guiding her through every movement, remembered the way he nodded whenever she got it right. She studied the room once again and noticed that one of the two guards usually stood close to the door with his back turned toward her. That could be an opportunity. In the darkness, Paige clenched her hands tightly and told herself in silence, "He will come. He will find me." And she was startled to realize that she believed it. For the first time in his life, Reed Kincaid lost control. The men who had worked for him for years, who had watched him face enemies, danger, and death without the slightest hesitation, had never seen him like this. When word reached Reed that Paige had disappeared, he was at his office in Boston. The man who delivered the news later said Reed's face changed in an instant. Those eyes ignited with a fire no one had ever seen before. He slammed his hand down on the desk so hard that his coffee cup flew to the floor and shattered. Then he began giving orders, his voice no longer calm as it usually was, but sharp and urgent like a wounded wolf. He tore through every source of information, called in every connection he had, from information brokers in the alleys of Boston to powerful figures in New York. He mobilized the entire Kincaid organization. Everyone had to search for Paige. No one was allowed to rest. No one was allowed to sleep, not until she was found. Maggie came as soon as she heard the news. She found her son pacing back and forth in his study, his hand clenched tight around his phone, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. She tried to calm him, telling him they would find Paige, telling him he needed to stay calm so he could think clearly. But Reed didn't listen. He turned toward his mother, and for the first time Maggie saw her son trembling. "I can't lose her," he said, his voice rough and raw. "I've waited too long for her." Meanwhile, Paige was trying to save herself. She had been sitting in the dark room for hours, watching, memorizing, waiting for an opportunity. She had noticed that one of the two guards often stood close to the door with his back turned toward her. He was careless, convinced that a tied-up woman couldn't possibly do anything. Paige decided to act. She began breathing fast, then slowly let herself slump sideways onto the floor. Closing her eyes and pretending to faint, she lay completely still and listened. Footsteps came closer. "Hey! Wake up!" The guard's voice rang out, touched with a hint of concern. He bent down, reaching out to turn her over. At that exact moment, Paige moved. She used the move Reed had taught her, twisting sharply and sweeping his legs out from under him. The guard lost his balance and crashed face first onto the floor. Paige rolled away and struggled to her feet, even though her hands were still tied behind her back. She ran toward the door and slammed her shoulder against the iron barrier, but it was locked. She hit it again, but it didn't budge. The guard had already gotten back up, his face red with fury. He came toward her, eyes blazing. Paige backed away until her spine struck the freezing metal door, her heart pounding wildly. Then she heard something outside. Footsteps. A lot of footsteps. Shouting. The crash of things being knocked over. The guard stopped and turned toward the door, confusion breaking across his face. Then the door burst open. Light flooded into the dark room like a wave breaking through a dam. Paige narrowed her eyes, blinded for a moment by the brightness, and then she saw the familiar figure standing in the doorway. Tall, broad-shouldered, gray eyes sweeping through the room, searching for her. Reed stepped into the room, his eyes sweeping across the space in a single instant, and he found her immediately. Paige was standing with her back pressed against the iron door, her hands still bound behind her, her hair disheveled, her face pale with fear and exhaustion. But she was still standing. She was still here. Reed ran to her, dropped to his knees in front of her, and gripped her shoulders with trembling hands. Those eyes were now filled with worry, filled with fear, filled with emotions Paige had never seen in him before. "Are you hurt? Did anyone touch you?" he asked, his voice rough and strained as his hands hurried to free her wrists. Paige shook her head, unable to speak. She looked at him, looked into those eyes searching all over her for any sign of injury, and suddenly something inside her broke wide open. Tears began to fall, tears she had thought she had forgotten how to shed long ago. She hadn't cried when Brooke humiliated her. She hadn't cried when her father sold her to pay his debt. She hadn't cried when she stepped into the strange house in Marshfield. But now, looking at Reed kneeling in front of her with shaking hands and terrified eyes, she cried. Reed pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could hardly breathe, but she didn't want him to let go. She buried her face against his chest, feeling his warmth, hearing the wild pounding of his heart. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice raw. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry." He said it over and over, as if there were no other words left in him. Paige had never heard the Grey Wolf apologize to anyone. She had never imagined that the most powerful man on the East Coast would kneel before someone and say those words, but he was doing it now, for her. Reed's men dealt with the others in the room. No one asked for details. No one needed to know what would happen to them. Paige didn't want to know, and she knew Reed would never tell her. That was his world, and he was shielding her from it in the only way he knew how. Reed carried Paige out to the car, refusing to let her walk even when she told him she could. He held her as though she were the most precious thing in the world, careful with every step, never taking his eyes off her for even a second. On the way back to Marshfield, he sat beside her in the back seat, his hand wrapped tightly around hers. He said nothing. He only held on. Paige felt the warmth of his hand spreading through her whole body. She looked out through the window and saw the night sky beginning to pale at the edge of the horizon. She had been trapped in that dark room for almost a full day, but now she was going home. When they reached the wooden house, Maggie was already waiting at the door. She ran forward and wrapped Paige in her arms, tears shining in her eyes, her lips repeating, "Thank God, thank God." Reed took Paige upstairs, laid her gently on the bed, and pulled the blanket over her. Then he sat down in the chair beside the bed. "Go to sleep," he said, his voice gentler than she had ever heard it before. "I'm here." Paige wanted to say something, wanted to thank him, wanted to ask if he was all right, but she was too tired. Her eyelids felt unbearably heavy, and the soft darkness of sleep began to pull her under. But before she drifted all the way down, she felt his hand close around hers, and she heard him whisper, so softly it was almost like breathing. "I can't lose you. I can't." Paige closed her eyes, but she knew he was still there. He would stay there all night, watching over her while she slept. And for the first time in a very long while, she felt truly safe. In the drifting blur of sleep, the words he had spoken echoed through her mind, and her heart, even in its exhaustion, still beat one quiet breath faster. The next morning, Maggie insisted on taking Paige to the hospital for an examination. Even though Paige said she was fine, Maggie wouldn't listen. Reed wouldn't listen either. He drove her to a private hospital on the outskirts of Boston, where the doctors and nurses all addressed him as Mr. Kincaid with unmistakable respect. The doctor examined Paige carefully and confirmed that she had only a few small abrasions on her wrists from the restraints and a handful of minor bruises. There were no serious injuries, no sign that she had been assaulted. She was lucky, but the doctor still recommended that she stay overnight for observation, in case she went into psychological shock after the trauma. Reed didn't leave. He sat in the chair beside her hospital bed, his eyes never leaving her for even a second. A nurse brought him a blanket and pillow, but he didn't use them. He only sat there, his back straight, his eyes open, like a soldier standing guard over the most precious treasure he had ever known. Paige drifted off from exhaustion, her sleep broken and uneasy, filled with shattered fragments of memory. The dark room, the restraints biting into her wrists, the cold eyes of the men guarding her, and then the light, gray eyes, warm arms around her. She woke at 3 o'clock in the morning, her heart still beating too fast from the aftershock of the nightmare. She opened her eyes, and the first thing she saw was Reed. He was still there, sitting in the same worn chair, his eyes on her, as though he had watched her through the entire night. "Didn't you sleep?" Paige asked, her voice still rough. "No." Silence stretched between them. There was only the steady sound of the heart monitor and the wind moving outside the hospital window. Paige looked at Reed in the dim light of the room. He looked exhausted, dark shadows under his eyes, yet he hadn't left. Then Reed spoke, his voice low and slow, as though every word carried a weight he had held for years. 8 years ago, there was a night. I was at my lowest point. I didn't want to keep going. Paige looked at him, and her heart began to beat faster. She said nothing. She waited. Reed looked out at the window, where the night sky was dark as ink. I had just taken over the organization after my father was gone. Everything collapsed at once. My enemies wanted me dead. The people I trusted betrayed me. Debts were piling up. I was 17, facing all of it alone, and I thought I couldn't do it. He stopped and took a slow, deep breath. That night, I was sitting in my car by the Boston shoreline. It was raining hard. I sat there for hours, ready to give up, ready to end everything. Paige felt her heart twist painfully inside her chest. She pictured a 17-year-old boy sitting alone in a car in the middle of a storm, carrying a burden far too large for someone that young. Then a girl walked past. Reed continued, his voice softer now. She didn't ask who I was. She wasn't afraid of a black car parked by the road in the middle of the storm. She just sat down, right beside my car, in the rain, for 2 hours. Paige felt something stirring in the back of her mind, something distant and familiar. A blurred memory began to shift and rise inside her. She didn't say anything, Reed said. She just stayed there, and when I finally rolled down the window, she handed me a handkerchief. Then she said, "I don't know what you're carrying, but please don't carry it alone." Reed turned back to look at Paige, his eyes as deep as the ocean. Then she left. She didn't ask my name. She didn't wait for me to thank her. She just walked away. He looked straight into her eyes, and Paige felt as if the world had stopped turning. "That girl was you, Paige." Paige began to tremble as the memory came rushing back, like lost pieces of her life finally finding their way home. The rainy night 8 years ago, she had been 20 years old, just finishing a late shift at a coffee shop. She had been walking home along the road by the water when she saw a black car parked at the side of the street. Someone was sitting inside, alone in the rain. She had no idea why she stopped, but she did. She sat down beside the car, letting the rain soak through her clothes, and she stayed there, because she could feel the pain of the person inside that car, even without seeing his face. The handkerchief from her mother. She had given that stranger the handkerchief her mother had left for her. Then she had gone home, thinking she would never see that person again. She had forgotten. The years had passed. The accident had happened. Sorrow had piled on top of sorrow. And she had forgotten that rainy night. But he remembered. He remembered every second of it. Paige sat bolt upright in the hospital bed, her eyes shining with tears as she stared at Reed without blinking. Her heart pounded wildly, her mind spinning with fragments of memory that were slowly locking back into place. The rainy night 8 years ago. The black car. The man whose face she had never clearly seen. Her mother's handkerchief. That was you? She asked, her voice trembling. Reed nodded and said nothing. Then he reached into the pocket of his suit jacket and took something out. An old handkerchief, white cotton cloth, faintly yellowed with time, the edges worn thin in places. But in the corner, 2 initials embroidered in blue thread were still clear. P.H. Paige Holloway. Paige looked at the handkerchief, and the tears spilled over before she could stop them. She recognized it at once. It was the handkerchief her mother had left her before she died. Her mother had embroidered Paige's initials into the corner with her own hands, telling her it was a gift so she would always remember that she was never alone, that her mother would always be beside her. Paige had thought she had lost it years ago, thought it had vanished somewhere in the chaos that followed the accident. But it was here, in Reed's hand, for 8 years. You gave this to me that night, Reed said, his voice low and soft. I've kept it for 8 years. Every time I wanted to give up, I looked at it and remembered the girl who sat in the rain for 2 hours because of a stranger. It reminded me that there were still people like you in this world. He placed the handkerchief into her hand, his fingers brushing hers for the briefest moment. After that night, I had people find you. I knew your name, your address, where you worked, everything about you. I knew about your accident. I knew you lost the ability to become a mother. I knew Wesley left you. I knew all of it. Paige stared at him, stunned. But I didn't dare come near you, Reed continued, and there was a trace of bitterness in his voice now. Because my world was too dark. You were light, and I was darkness. I was afraid that if I stepped into your life, I would drag you into the shadows. I would destroy you the way my father destroyed my mother. Paige felt her heart ache sharply at those words. 8 years. He had known her for 8 years, had watched over her from a distance, had kept her handkerchief like a sacred thing. Yet he hadn't dared come near her because he was afraid of hurting her. Then why now did you? She asked, unable to finish the thought. Reed looked at her, and for the first time Paige saw an unguarded tenderness in those eyes. Because your father placed you in my hands. When I heard he owed money and my organization bought the debt, I knew this was the only chance I would ever have. I made the condition that I would marry one of his 2 daughters, because I knew Brooke would never agree. I knew you would be the one who came to me. He stopped and drew in a deep breath. And when your father truly brought you to me, I couldn't let you fall into anyone else's hands. I wasn't noble enough for that. I'd waited too long for you. Paige sat there, tears running freely down her face, her hand clenched tightly around the old handkerchief. She thought about the past 8 years, about the lonely nights, about all the times she had asked herself whether anyone in this world truly cared about her. It turned out someone had. There had been one person who had cared for her for 8 years, from afar, in silence. She didn't say a word. She only reached for him and wrapped her arms tightly around him. And Reed, the man all of Boston feared, the gray wolf with eyes cold as winter ice, held her back as though she were the most precious thing he had ever known. 2 weeks after that night in the hospital, everything changed. Reed no longer disappeared at dawn and returned at midnight. He began eating breakfast with Paige, sitting across from her at the table, drinking coffee while she ate toast. They didn't say much, but the silence was no longer heavy the way it had once been. It was the silence of 2 people learning how to be beside each other. They walked together along the shoreline every afternoon. Reed told her about Marshfield, about the years he had grown up there under Maggie's care. Paige told him about her mother, about the happy days before she died. They spoke more during those 2 weeks than they had in all the months before put together. Paige had begun to call Marshfield home. Not because she was forced to, but because, for the first time in many years, she felt that she belonged somewhere. The wooden house in the pine forest no longer felt like a place of captivity. It was the place where Reed was, where Maggie was, where peaceful mornings and safe nights existed. But darkness had not let them go. What happened in New York had been dealt with, and the men who kidnapped Paige had received the consequences they deserved. But one man had survived. One man had escaped before Reed's people arrived, and he was looking for a way back. His name was Marcus Webb, a former member of the Kincaid organization who had once worked under Reed's father many years earlier. His brother had also been one of the organization's men, until Reed's father discovered his betrayal and dealt with him in his own way. Marcus had fled to New York after that, joined a rival group, and waited for a chance to take revenge. The kidnapping of Paige had been his plan, but it had failed. Now he had nothing left to lose. He knew the security system around the house in Marshfield, because he had once been the one who designed it. He knew Reed's routines because he still had old sources feeding him information. He knew the exact day Maggie usually scheduled maintenance checks. On what seemed like an ordinary afternoon, while Paige was in the kitchen preparing lunch and Reed was working downstairs in his study, a small truck with the logo of a maintenance company stopped at the gate. The security team checked the paperwork, saw that it matched the appointment Maggie had scheduled, and let the vehicle through. They didn't know the real crew had been replaced earlier that morning. Marcus walked into the house wearing a worker's uniform and carrying a toolbox in his hand. He went straight to Reed's study, where the door stood slightly open. Reed was seated behind his desk, reviewing some documents. He looked up at the sound of footsteps, and his eyes recognized the danger at once. Marcus stood in the doorway, his eyes burning with hatred. "Long time no see, Reed," he said, his voice sharp with bitterness. "Or should I call you the Grey Wolf, like the rest of them do?" Reed rose slowly to his feet, without the slightest sign of panic. He had faced death too many times to fear it now. "Marcus Webb, I thought you died in New York. I lived longer than you expected." Marcus stepped farther into the room, his hand dropping toward his waist, where something was hidden beneath the worker's shirt. "Your father ruined my brother. You ended your father. Today I end the Kincaid bloodline." Reed stood his ground without taking a single step back. He looked Marcus straight in the eye, his voice calm in a way that was colder than anger. "My father ruined a lot of people. Your brother wasn't the only one. He was a man without limits, and I don't regret what happened to him. But if you think killing me will give anything back to you, you're wrong." Marcus let out a harsh laugh, then pulled out the thing hidden under his shirt. Cold metal flashed in the noon light. "I don't need anything back. I just need you dead." His finger tightened. Reed didn't blink, and at that exact moment, a figure hurled into the room. Paige was in the kitchen when she heard voices coming from Reed's study. One of them was unfamiliar, not a voice she recognized. Instinct made her set the knife down and move quietly into the hallway. She looked through the narrow opening of the half-open door, and the blood in her body seemed to turn to ice. A stranger was standing across from Reed, and in his hand was something cold and deadly. Reed stood behind his desk, calm, but with no way out. She didn't think. She only acted. Paige shoved the door wide open, rushed into the room, and placed herself directly between Reed and the attacker. Everything happened in an instant. Marcus froze, not expecting anyone to appear. Reed shouted, and for the first time she heard true panic in his voice. "Paige, move!" But she didn't. She stood there with her back to Reed, face to face with the man holding the weapon. Her heart was pounding wildly. Her legs were trembling, but she didn't step back. She looked Marcus straight in the eye, and her voice came out clear even with the faint tremor in it. "If you want to hurt him, you'll have to go through me first." Marcus blinked and hesitated. He hadn't planned for this. He had come to finish Reed Kincaid, not to face a woman using her own body as a shield. He could have pushed her aside easily enough, but there was something in her eyes that stopped him. It wasn't the look of someone weak. It was the look of someone willing to die to protect what she loved. Reed wrapped an arm around Paige's waist, trying to pull her behind him. "Paige, don't be insane. Move back right now." But Paige held her ground, her feet planted, as if roots had grown through the floor. She wouldn't let him push her behind him. She wouldn't let him stand in front of her. "No." Her voice shook, but it didn't break. "I won't stand there and watch you get hurt in front of me. I can't do that." The tension stretched on for what felt like forever. Marcus stood there with the weapon still in his hand, his eyes shifting from Paige to Reed and back to Paige again. He was calculating. He was weighing his next move. The air in the room grew so heavy it was hard to breathe. Then footsteps sounded in the hallway. Many footsteps, heavy and urgent. Reed's security team, the men who had finally realized something was wrong. They stormed into the room, 3 men dressed in black, and overpowered Marcus before he had time to react. The weapon hit the floor with a cold metallic clatter. He was forced down, his hands pinned behind his back, his mouth spilling curses no one cared to hear. They dragged him away. The door closed behind them. The room fell silent again, with nothing left but the sound of Paige and Reed breathing too fast. Paige was still standing there, but now her legs began to shake violently as the surge of adrenaline started to leave her body. She nearly collapsed, but Reed caught her. Then he turned her around to face him, and Paige saw that his face had gone pale, not with fear for himself, with fear for her. "Are you out of your mind?" he shouted, his voice shaking with the storm of emotions inside him, fear tangled with anger. "You could have died. Do you understand me? He could have hurt you. What were you thinking?" Paige looked at him, her eyes red, tears beginning to spill down her cheeks. But she didn't regret it. She would have done it 1,000 times over if she had to. "Did you think I'd stand there and watch the man I love get hurt?" she said, her voice breaking. "Did you think I'd hide somewhere while you—" She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Reed went completely still. The whole room fell silent. The man I love. What had she just said? Reed stared at Paige, his eyes wide, as if he couldn't trust what he had just heard. It was the first time she had said love. The first time she had spoken aloud the thing both of them had felt but neither had dared name. Paige stood there with tears streaming down her face, her heart pounding out of control, waiting for him to say something. Anything. Reed said nothing. He only took 2 long steps toward her, then pulled her into his arms. He held her so tightly she could barely breathe, but she didn't want him to let go. She buried her face against his chest, feeling the warmth of him, the familiar cedar scent of his cologne. And in the silence, Paige could hear the wild hammering of his heart. They stood there in the silent room, neither of them letting go. The outside world seemed to stop existing. There were only the two of them, suspended inside everything that had just happened, inside the words that had finally been spoken aloud. Reed slowly drew back just enough to look into Paige's eyes. Those eyes were searching her face for something, as though he still couldn't quite believe what he had just heard. "What did you just say?" he asked, his voice rough and unsteady. Paige pressed her lips together, her cheeks burning red with embarrassment, and with the flood of emotion rising inside her chest. She had said it now. She couldn't take it back, and she didn't want to. "You heard me," she answered softly, her eyes dropping for a moment. "Say it again." His voice wasn't a command. It wasn't a demand. It was a plea. The plea of a man who had waited far too long to hear those words. Paige lifted her gaze and looked straight into the gray eyes waiting for her. She drew in a deep breath and felt her heart beating wildly inside her chest. "I love you," she said, clear and certain. "I love you, Reed." Reed closed his eyes, as if he were trying to memorize every syllable, every tone, every breath in that sentence. He stood perfectly still, his chest rising and falling, and Paige saw the way his jaw tightened, as if he were struggling to hold something back. Then he opened his eyes, and in those eyes, Paige saw something she had never seen there before. Tears. The powerful boss, the Grey Wolf, the man no one in Boston even dared to name, the man as cold as winter ice, was crying. Because of her. The tears slid down his face quietly, beyond his control. He didn't try to hide them. He didn't turn away. He let her see the most fragile part of him, the part he had never shown to anyone. "You don't know what you are to me," he said, his voice raw with emotion. 8 years ago, you saved my life. You didn't know it, but you did. You were the reason I didn't give up that night. For 8 years, you've been the reason I still wanted to wake up every morning. Every time I was tired, every time I wanted to walk away from everything, I thought of you. I thought of the girl who sat in the rain for 2 hours because of a stranger. He raised his hand and touched her cheek, his trembling fingers brushing away the tears on her face. And now you've given me something I never thought I deserved to have. Love. Paige felt as if her heart might burst from happiness. "I love you, Paige," Reed said, and his voice sounded like a vow. "I've loved you since that night in the rain. I've loved you for the past 8 years, and I'll love you for the rest of my life." Paige cried and smiled at the same time. Tears streamed down her face, but her lips curved into the brightest smile she had ever worn. She, the useless woman her family had abandoned, the woman her sister had called worthless and cast aside, was being loved by the most powerful man in Boston as though she were a treasure beyond price. 1 week after the day they told each other they were in love, Reed came to find Paige in the afternoon. He was wearing a white shirt, car keys in hand, and there was something mysterious flickering in his eyes. "Come with me," he said, offering no further explanation. Paige didn't ask where they were going. She had learned by now that Reed wasn't a man who liked to explain everything in advance. He preferred action. She took her coat and got into the car with him. Reed drove out of Marshfield and headed toward Boston. They traveled for an hour, past familiar roads, past fields and pine forests, past little towns scattered along the shoreline. Paige looked out the window and saw the sky slowly turning gray. Dark clouds were rolling in from the ocean, and the first drops of rain had begun to fall. When the car stopped, Paige recognized the place immediately. The coastal road, the rocky edge overlooking the sea, the weak yellow streetlights glowing through the curtain of rain. This was where she had stopped 8 years ago, where she had sat in the rain for 2 hours beside a black car, where she had given her mother's handkerchief to a stranger and told him not to carry his burden alone. Her heart began to beat faster. Reed got out, walked around, and opened the door for her. He took her hand and led her outside, stopping in the exact place where his car had once been parked that night. Rain fell softly over their shoulders, but neither of them seemed to notice. Reed looked at her, his eyes deep as the ocean in the distance. "The first time you stood here, you saved my life without even knowing it," he said, his voice low and warm. "You gave me hope when I had nothing left. You gave me a reason to keep going when I was ready to give up." Then he went down on one knee. Right there on the coastal road, in the light rain, Reed Kincaid knelt before Paige. The most powerful boss on the East Coast was kneeling in front of her, rain falling over his shoulders, his eyes never leaving her for even a second. Paige felt as though her heart had stopped. "This time, I want to ask you something," Reed said as he took a small black velvet box from his pocket. He opened it, and inside was a ring. Not a large, showy diamond, not glittering platinum, just a simple but beautifully crafted silver ring with a small blue stone, the color of the handkerchief, the color she loved most. "We were married on paper," Reed said, "but that was because of your father's debt. That was an arrangement, not love." He looked up at her, rain falling across his face, and he didn't care. "Today, I want to ask you again. Not because of debt, not because of a deal, but because I love you. Paige Holloway, will you be my wife, truly, for real?" Paige stood there, tears blending with the rain on her cheeks. She looked at the man kneeling before her, the man who had waited for her for 8 years, the man who had loved her from afar in silence, the man who had protected her, respected her, and shown her what it meant to be truly cherished. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with emotion but certain. "Yes, I will. I'll be your wife." Reed rose to his feet, his hand trembling slightly as he slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as though it had been made for her and her alone. Then he lifted her face, looked into her eyes for a long moment, and kissed her. Their first real kiss, not a kiss in a forced wedding ceremony, not a kiss given out of duty. This was a kiss born of love, of 8 years of waiting, of 2 hearts that had finally found each other. And in the rain, in the very place where fate had first joined their lives 8 years before, Paige became Reed Kincaid's wife not because she was forced, but because she chose him. 1 month after that rainy night by the sea, Paige and Reed's life had become something entirely different. They were no longer 2 strangers living beneath the same roof. They were husband and wife in the truest sense, loving each other, sharing every small moment of the day. Each morning, Paige woke in Reed's arms. Each evening, they sat together on the porch overlooking the sea, talking about everything and nothing at the same time. The wooden house in the middle of the pine forest was filled with laughter, conversation, and a warmth Paige had thought she had lost forever when her mother died. She was happy, truly happy, but the past wouldn't leave them alone. One afternoon, Maggie stepped into the living room with an unusual expression on her face. She stood there for a moment, as if weighing how to say it, then finally spoke. "There are people here to see you. Your father and your sister." Paige went still. She set down her teacup, feeling as though someone had just poured ice water down her spine. Her father, Brooke. Why were they here? "They're waiting outside the gate," Maggie said. "Do you want to see them? If not, I'll tell them to leave." Paige was silent for a long time. Then she rose to her feet. "Let them in." 10 minutes later, Gerald and Brooke Holloway stepped into the living room of the wooden house, and Paige saw that both of them were in shock. They stood there with their eyes wide, looking around the spacious room with its gleaming oak floors, marble fireplace, and paintings hanging on the walls. Through the windows, they could see the lush green garden, the surrounding pine forest, and the blue sea in the distance. Men dressed in black stood watch everywhere, silent and intimidating. This wasn't some miserable little shack where they had imagined Paige was living in misery with a monster. This was an estate, a hidden paradise tucked into nature itself. Gerald looked far thinner than the last time Paige had seen him. His skin was lined, his eyes sunken, his back bent as though he no longer had the strength to carry even his own body. He looked as if he had aged 20 years in a matter of months. Brooke stood beside him, and Paige almost didn't recognize her sister. The golden hair Brooke had once cared for so carefully was now dry and lifeless. The skin that had once been smooth and pale was now drained of color, with dark shadows beneath her eyes. The clothes she wore were no longer designer pieces, only ordinary garments already worn thin. Her arrogance was gone. Her triumphant smile was gone. All that remained was desperation. Paige sat on the sofa and looked in silence at the two people who had once been her family. She didn't invite them to sit down. She only waited. Gerald spoke first, his voice trembling. "Paige, I'm sick. The doctor says I need surgery, but I don't have the money. I came here too." He didn't finish the sentence, but Paige understood. Brooke continued, tears beginning to run down her face. "Paige, I'm sorry. I know I was wrong. I shouldn't have said those things to you. I shouldn't have treated you that way. Please forgive me." She dropped to her knees, clutching Paige's hand, sobbing. "I don't have a job. No one will hire me. I have nothing left. Please help me. You're the only sister I have." Paige looked at her sister, the one who had once called her useless, worthless, the kind of woman no man would ever want, the one who had pretended to faint in order to push her into this marriage, the one who had contacted a rival gang to hurt her. And now that same woman was kneeling at her feet, crying and begging. Paige didn't feel anger. She had moved beyond anger a long time ago. She only felt tired of these people, of this past, of everything they had done to her. She was about to open her mouth and say something, but Gerald spoke again before she could. He looked around the room, then looked at Paige with a strange expression in his eyes. "I never expected you to be able to live here, with a man like him." The air in the room turned to ice. Paige looked at her father, unable to believe what she had just heard. He had come here begging for money, kneeling for help, and now he was insulting her husband, in his own home. "What man, Dad?" she asked, her voice turning cold. Gerald didn't seem to notice the change in his daughter's tone. He kept going, as if he were stating something obvious. "He's a man from the underworld, Paige. Everyone in Boston knows it. He's the Grey Wolf, the man people only dare whisper about. He doesn't deserve my daughter. You deserve better than that." Paige sat still for a moment and let those words sink into the silence. Then she stood up, slowly, decisively. Gerald lifted his head to look at her, perhaps expecting agreement, expecting his daughter to nod and say he was right. But the eyes looking back at him were no longer the eyes of the obedient girl she had once been. "You're saying he doesn't deserve me?" Paige's voice trembled, but not with fear, with anger, with all the years she had stayed silent and endured, all the times she had swallowed her tears, all the wounds she had carried alone. "You sold me like a piece of property to cover your failures," she said, each word sharp as a blade. "You stood by while Brooke tore me down, and you never once looked back until you needed money. Don't speak to me of what he deserves. You lost that right the day you let me walk out that door." Brooke sat curled into herself on the chair, not daring to lift her eyes. Gerald had gone pale, his lips moving, but no words came out. Paige went on, her voice steadier now. "And him? He has never forced me to do anything. On our wedding night, he gave me my own room and told me he wouldn't step inside unless I allowed it. He taught me how to defend myself, so I could protect myself. He came for me when I was taken. He saved me. He held me in his arms and apologized, because he thought he hadn't protected me well enough." She drew in one deep breath, and tears began to burn in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "He loves me. He has loved me since 8 years ago, when I was nothing but a stranger sitting in the rain beside his car. He waited for me for 8 years, watched over me from a distance, and never dared come near because he was afraid of hurting me. And when you placed me in his hands, he loved me, respected me, protected me as if I were the most precious thing in the world. She looked straight into her father's eyes. You don't have the right to speak about my husband that way. You don't deserve to. Gerald sat there like stone, his face drained of all color. Brooke didn't dare open her mouth either. She only sat there trembling. Just then, footsteps sounded from the doorway. Reed stepped into the room, tall and commanding as always. He had heard everything. He didn't say a word to Gerald or Brooke. He only walked straight to Paige and stood beside her, his hand resting lightly against the small of her back, exactly like in the dream she had once had, exactly like the image she had once imagined of someone who would always stand beside her. He looked at Gerald and Brooke, his gray eyes cold but not threatening. He didn't need to threaten them. His presence said everything. And in the way Reed looked at Paige, something shone there. Pride. He didn't need to protect her. She had protected herself. Brooke refused to yield. Even after Paige had defeated her with nothing but words, even while standing inside the home of the man she had once mocked and despised, she still wouldn't bow her head. Maybe it was a habit too deeply carved into her blood, the habit of always needing to be the winner, always needing to have the final word. She rose to her feet, her eyes red with rage and humiliation. You think you're better than me? Brooke screamed, her voice shrill and trembling. You still can't have children. No matter how much money you have, no matter who protects you, you still can't give him a child. You're still an incomplete woman. Paige stood frozen, as though nailed to the floor. Those words cut into her heart, sharp and deep as a knife. Even though she had grown stronger, even though she had learned how to love herself, that wound was still there. It had never truly disappeared. It had only been covered beneath the hard shell she had built around herself through the years. Reed's hand tightened, his jaw locking hard. He was about to step forward, about to say something to Brooke, but another voice rose first. That's enough. Maggie stepped into the living room, her stride steady despite her age. She moved to Paige's side and faced Brooke, and the warm brown eyes that were usually so gentle had turned cold as steel. My daughter-in-law doesn't need to bear children to have value, she said, her voice clear and unwavering. A woman's worth doesn't live in her womb. It lives in her heart, in her spirit, in the way she treats other people. Brooke opened her mouth as if she meant to speak, but Maggie gave her no chance. A woman's worth isn't in her womb. It's in her heart. I didn't give birth to Reed, yet he is my son in every way that matters. Blood doesn't make a family, Brooke, love and sacrifice do. And looking at you, it's clear you have neither. Maggie looked Brooke up and down, and didn't bother to hide her contempt. And you? You had a mother, a father, a sister. You were born into a whole family. But what did you do with that gift? You pushed your sister away to save yourself. You insulted the person who sacrificed for you. You betrayed your own blood. She stopped, letting those words sink into the silence. Who do you have now? Brooke stood there stunned into stillness. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. For the first time in her life, she had nothing to say back, no excuse, no fake tears that could save her. Paige looked at her mother-in-law, tears streaming freely down her cheeks. It was the first time in her life that anyone had ever stepped forward to defend her like this. Reed stepped forward and stood in front of Gerald and Brooke. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to threaten them. His presence alone was enough to make them shrink into themselves like children caught doing something shameful. His voice never rose, but it was so cold that the air in the room seemed to freeze around it. I'll pay for your treatment, he said to Gerald, his eyes holding not a trace of warmth. Because of Paige, not because of you. You don't deserve help. But my wife has a kinder heart than I do, and she wouldn't be at peace knowing her father was in pain and left untreated. Gerald nodded quickly, his eyes fixed on the floor, not daring to lift his face and meet his son-in-law's gaze. He had lost the right to call himself a father long ago, and now all he was a sick old man receiving pity from the very person he had once looked down on. Reed turned to Brooke, and she stepped back on instinct. Those eyes looked at her the way someone might look at an insect, not even with anger, only with cold contempt. As for you, he said, his voice like ice, today I let you walk out because you're my wife's sister. But if you ever open your mouth to insult Paige again, even once, I will make sure you understand what consequences mean. Brooke trembled, her lips moving, but she didn't dare let a single word come out. For the first time in her life, she was completely silent before another person. Reed gave a signal to the security men standing outside the door. Take them out. 2 men dressed in black stepped inside, and quietly escorted Gerald and Brooke out of the living room. There was no goodbye, no parting embrace, no promise that they would ever see each other again, only the fading sound of footsteps and the click of the door closing behind them. When they were gone, the room fell quiet again. Maggie held Paige's hand for a moment, then quietly slipped away, leaving the husband and wife alone. Paige stood by the window, looking out at the front garden. She saw the car carrying Gerald and Brooke moving slowly along the gravel road toward the gate. 2 figures sat inside, small and pitiful. Reed came to stand beside her, his hand finding hers, his fingers threading through hers. "Are you all right?" he asked gently. Paige turned to look at him, and she smiled, not a strained smile. Not the kind of smile people wear when they're trying to look strong. A real smile. The smile of someone who had finally been set free. "I'm all right," she said. "For the first time in my life, I'm truly all right." The iron gate closed behind Gerald and Brooke, and Paige knew that was the last time she would ever let the past walk back into her life. 3 months after the day Gerald and Brooke left Marshfield, Paige and Reed's life had become completely peaceful. They lived like an ordinary married couple, even though there was nothing ordinary about their life at all. Waking beside each other every morning, watching the sunset over the sea together every evening, learning each day how to love each other more deeply. Paige had found the happiness she had once believed she would never have. One day, Maggie asked Paige to go with her to a special place. It was a social care center on the outskirts of Boston, one that the Kincaid organization had supported financially for many years. Reed never spoke much about the charitable work he did, but Maggie said this was one of the causes he cared about most, because he understood what it felt like to be a child with no one. When they arrived at the center, Paige looked around and felt her chest tighten. Children of all ages were playing in the yard, but there was something in their eyes that made her want to cry. Loneliness, waiting, a longing to be loved. Then she saw a little girl sitting alone in the corner of the room. A 3-year-old girl sat apart from the others, clutching a worn teddy bear. Her eyes held a profound, quiet sorrow that mirrored Paige's own past. In that tiny, lonely figure, Paige saw a soul waiting to be found. One of the staff members noticed the way Paige was staring and explained in a soft voice. "Her name is Lily. She doesn't have any relatives. She was brought here when she was very little. She's terribly shy and hasn't bonded with anyone since she came. Every time someone comes to adopt, she stays as far away as she can." Paige looked at the little girl, and it felt as though something was squeezing her heart. She saw herself in those eyes. Lonely, abandoned, waiting for someone to come. She didn't walk straight over to Lily. She lowered herself to the floor a few steps away, without forcing anything, without trying to make the child respond. She only sat there quietly, looking out the window as though she too were waiting for something. Lily lifted her head and looked at her. She didn't seem afraid. She didn't turn away. She only watched, as though she were judging, as though she were deciding something deep inside herself. Then, slowly, she stood up. She walked toward Paige in tiny little steps, still clutching the teddy bear tightly in her arms. And then she reached out and took Paige's hand. Her tiny hand was warm and soft, holding onto Paige as though she were afraid Paige might disappear if she let go. She didn't let go. Maggie stood a little distance away with tears shining in her eyes. She whispered to one of the staff members, "She has never done that with anyone before." Paige looked at Lily, and in the little girl's eyes she saw herself, a lonely child still waiting for someone to love her. That evening, Paige told Reed about Lily. She sat across from him in the living room, turning her mother's old handkerchief between her fingers, her heart full of quiet worry. She told him about the little girl's eyes, about the way Lily had held onto her hand and refused to let go, about the feeling that fate itself had arranged that meeting. Reed said nothing. He only listened in silence, his eyes never leaving her face. Paige bit her lip, her voice trembling slightly. "I know we've never really talked about children, and I can't." She didn't finish the sentence, but Reed understood. He cut in gently, his voice calm. "You want to adopt her." It wasn't a question. It was a certainty. Paige lifted her head and looked at him, her eyes shining. "I do." Reed nodded without the slightest hesitation. "Then we'll adopt her." Paige stared at him in surprise. "You don't need more time to think about it? This is a huge decision." "You don't need time?" Reed rose from his chair, came over, and sat beside her, taking her hand in his. He looked at her, and his eyes were warmer than she had ever seen them. "You want this. That's reason enough. They began the adoption process the very next week. It lasted 4 months, filled with paperwork, interviews, and inspections. But in the end, Lily officially became the daughter of Reed and Paige Kincaid. On the day they brought Lily home, she was still shy, clutching her old teddy bear close, but her hand never left Paige's for even a second. The wooden house in the pine forest was now filled with the sound of a child's laughter, with the tiny footsteps of little feet running across the wooden floors. That night, Lily slept in her own pink bedroom, which Paige had decorated herself by hand. She sat beside the little girl's bed, singing softly, her hand smoothing over the child's soft brown hair. Reed stood by the doorway, one shoulder resting against the frame, silently watching the 2 most important girls in his life. "You're going to be a wonderful mother," he said softly. Paige looked up and smiled. "I never thought I'd get to be a mother." "Now you are." That night, Paige looked at Lily sleeping peacefully, then at Reed standing in the doorway, and she knew, a family is made of the people who choose to stay. 6 months after Lily came home, life in the Kincaid family was filled with laughter. Lily had slowly begun to open her heart, and she now called Paige Mom and Reed Dad in a clear, sweet little voice. She was no longer as shy as before, even though there were still moments when she preferred to sit alone holding her old teddy bear. The wooden house in the middle of the pine forest had truly become a home, but then Paige began to feel that something in her body was changing. She was more tired than usual, even though she hadn't been doing anything physically demanding. Every morning when she woke up, she felt dizzy and nauseated, and she had to sit still for a while before she could stand. At first, she thought it was only because the weather had changed, or because she had been spending so much time caring for Lily. But the symptoms didn't go away. They became clearer with each passing day. Maggie was the first to notice. She watched Paige with a strange look in her eyes for several days, then finally spoke. "Go see a doctor. Don't ignore this." Paige tried to refuse, saying she was fine. But Maggie wouldn't listen. She insisted on taking her to the hospital, saying that health was never something to joke about. At the hospital, the doctor ran a series of tests. Paige sat in the waiting room with a restless feeling she couldn't shake. She didn't even know exactly what she was afraid of, only that she had the sense something was about to change. Then the doctor returned and looked at her with an expression that was half surprise and half congratulations. "Mrs. Kincaid, you're pregnant." Paige thought she must have heard wrong. "Pregnant?" she repeated, her voice trembling. "But the doctors said I couldn't. After the accident, they told me I couldn't have children." The doctor smiled gently. "You were previously told the chances were very low, not that it was completely impossible. In some rare cases, when the body is fully rested, when stress is reduced, when a person's emotional state becomes stable, this can happen, and it seems your life has been very happy lately." Paige sat there with tears streaming down her face. She didn't know whether she was crying from joy or from shock, perhaps from both at once. She placed her hand over her stomach, where a tiny new life was beginning, and she felt as though she were dreaming. But beneath the joy, a quiet fear slipped into her heart. Lily. She thought of her little daughter at home, the child who had only just found a family after so many lonely years. She was afraid Lily would think she no longer mattered once a new baby came. She was afraid Lily would feel abandoned all over again. Paige went home with her heart racing. She didn't know how she was going to say it, but she knew she had to. That evening, Paige asked Reed to come into the room. She was sitting on the bed with one hand resting over her stomach, her heart full of both worry and happiness. When Reed sat down beside her, she told him everything. The test results, the shock, the miracle she had never believed she would receive, and the fear that was quietly tormenting her. "I'm afraid Lily will think she isn't important anymore once the new baby comes," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm afraid she'll feel abandoned all over again. I can't let that happen." Reed was silent for a moment, his eyes fixed on her with so much love it almost hurt to look at him. Then he pulled her into his arms and held her tightly. "Lily is our first child," he said, his voice low and warm. "This baby is our second. Neither one matters more than the other. They both belong to this family. We will love them equally, and Lily will understand that." Paige cried in his arms, but they were tears of happiness. 9 months later, they welcomed a baby boy into the world. Lily, who was 4 years old by then, stood beside her baby brother's crib, her round brown eyes wide as she looked at him sleeping peacefully. She stretched out her tiny hand, wrapped her fingers around his, and smiled with all the sunlight in the world. "Mom, he's so cute. I'll protect him for the rest of my life." Paige stood beside the hospital bed, looking at her 2 children, then at Reed standing beside her, and she felt as though her heart might burst open from happiness. She remembered where she had been 1 year earlier. She had been the useless woman her family abandoned, the woman handed over to the monster no one in Boston even dared to name. Now she had a husband who loved her, a gentle mother-in-law, 2 children, and a family made whole by love. And the monster the whole city feared? He was standing there with their son in his arms, singing softly in that deep, warm voice while his gray eyes rested tenderly on the baby sleeping against his chest. Paige looked at the scene before her, and she knew she didn't need to prove anything to anyone. She had been loved, she had been chosen, and that was everything she had ever needed. If you loved Paige and the Grey Wolf story, please leave a like to support us. Share this video with your friends, with anyone who loves stories where fate is turned upside down, where the one who was looked down on becomes the one most deeply loved in the end. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the emotional stories we share every day. How did this story make you feel? Leave a comment below and share what is truly in your heart. We'd love to hear your thoughts. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace and love. Thank you for watching. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.